She stood in chains under the auction sun, young, flawless, and worth more than any other woman there. But when the bidding began, the crowd went silent. Not a single hand was raised. This is the terrifying reason why no one dared to bid on the most beautiful slave of 1880. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the auction platform in Charleston, South Carolina. It was March 1880, 15 years after the 13th Amendment had supposedly abolished slavery forever. Yet here, in the dusty corners of the reconstructed South, old practices died harder than the law intended. Amara stood on the platform, her head held impossibly high despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists. At 23 years old, she possessed a striking beauty that should have commanded attention, high cheekbones that caught the light, eyes the color of dark honey, and a bearing that spoke of dignity no auction block could diminish. Her dress, though threadbare and stained from weeks of travel, still draped her tall frame with an almost regal quality. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Hutchins, with tobacco-stained teeth and sweat rings spreading beneath his arms, surveyed the gathered crowd with growing unease. 50 men stood before him, plantation owners and labor contractors looking for workers to exploit under the guise of convict leasing and debt peonage. The South's new slavery, dressed in the thin veneer of legality. "Gentlemen," Hutchins bellowed, his voice carrying across the square, "feast your eyes on this prime specimen, young, strong, and as you can plainly see, possessed of considerable attributes that might serve a household well." The crowd shuffled, but no one stepped forward. Nervous glances were exchanged. Hutchins frowned, confusion creasing his already lined face. "Come now, do I hear $50, 20? Surely someone recognizes quality when they see it." Still, silence hung in the humid air like a curse. What Hutchins didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Amara was already a legend among those who trafficked in human misery. For 3 years, she had been sold and resold across 5 states, and each time her owners met with inexplicable ruin. The first, a cotton plantation owner in Mississippi, lost his entire crop to an unseasonable freeze the week after purchasing her. The second suffered a mysterious fire that consumed his barn and half his assets. The third fell from his horse and broke his neck. The fourth went mad, raving about shadows that followed him even in daylight. By the fifth owner, word had begun to spread through the dark networks of those who dealt in forced labor. The woman was cursed, hexed, a witch, some whispered, though she never spoke of such things, never threatened or warned. She simply existed, and disaster followed. Among the crowd stood Thomas Bridgewater, a man who didn't believe in curses. At 38, he was young for a plantation owner, but ruthless in his efficiency. He'd built his wealth through convict leasing, a system where black men and women were arrested on spurious charges, vagrancy, loitering, breach of contract, and then leased to private businesses that worked them as brutally as any antebellum slave master. Bridgewater studied Amara with calculating eyes. He'd heard the rumors, of course, but he was a man of the new age, the industrial age. Superstition was for the weak-minded. What he saw was a woman whose supposed curse had driven her price down to nothing, a bargain too good to pass up. $10, he called out, his voice cutting through the silence. The crowd turned to look at him, eyes wide with shock and a touch of fear. Hutchins nearly dropped his gavel. $10, he stammered, Sir, surely you mean I mean exactly $10, Bridgewater said firmly. Given the circumstances, I believe that's more than fair. Hutchins glanced at Amara, who had turned her gaze upon Bridgewater. For the first time that morning she smiled, a small, knowing expression that sent an involuntary shiver down the auctioneer's spine. Sold, Hutchins declared quickly, as if eager to be rid of her, to Mr. Bridgewater for $10. As Bridgewater approached the platform to claim his purchase, an old black woman in the crowd caught his eye. She was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles earned through decades of suffering and survival. She shook her head slowly, deliberately, her expression a mixture of pity and warning. Bridgewater ignored her. He'd built his fortune by ignoring omens. Bridgewater's estate, Magnolia Grove, sprawled across 200 acres of South Carolina lowlands. The main house was a fading monument to antebellum glory. White columns that had seen better days, a wide veranda where generations of enslaved people had served mint juleps to their masters, and rooms filled with furniture older than the Confederacy itself. But the real engine of Bridgewater's wealth lay in the barracks behind the house, where 63 men and women lived in conditions that mocked the very concept of freedom. They were technically convicts, leased from the state for their labor, but their crimes ranged from the absurd to the non-existent. A man named Jacob was serving time for looking at a white woman disrespectfully. A woman named Ruth had been arrested for walking with intent to solicit when she was simply walking home from church. Another man, Samuel, had been charged with breach of contract for leaving a job where he hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. This was Bridgewater's kingdom, and here he was absolute master. He led Amara to a small cabin near the main house, separate from the barracks. "You'll work in the house," he informed her curtly. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever my wife requires. The rules are simple. Work hard, don't talk back, and don't cause trouble. Can you manage that?" Amara spoke for the first time, her voice low and melodious, with an accent that carried hints of the Georgia Sea Islands mixed with something older, something that seemed to echo from across an ocean. "I will do what must be done, Mr. Bridgewater, just as you will." He frowned at the cryptic response, but dismissed it. Within the hour, Amara was installed in the kitchen, and Bridgewater returned to his normal routine, already forgetting the warnings he'd heard. But that night, as he lay in bed beside his pale, sickly wife, Eleanor, he heard something that made him sit upright in the darkness. Singing. A woman's voice carrying across the still night air, singing in a language he didn't recognize. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and somehow terrible all at once. "What is that?" Eleanor whispered, her hand clutching his arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Just the new house girl," Bridgewater said, trying to sound dismissive. "Go back to sleep." But he didn't sleep himself. He lay awake until dawn, listening to that strange, otherworldly song, and wondering for the first time if perhaps there was something to the rumors after all. The trouble began subtly, as it always did. On Amara's third day at Magnolia Grove, Bridgewater's best horse, a stallion he'd paid $200 for, threw a shoe, stepped on a snake, and broke its leg so badly it had to be put down. The same day, a rider arrived with news that the cotton broker in Charleston who handled Bridgewater's sales had absconded with 3 months of receipts, nearly $800. Coincidence, Bridgewater muttered to himself, though the word tasted like ash in his mouth. The following week, 5 of his leased convicts fell ill with a mysterious ailment that left them feverish and unable to work. The prison doctor could find no cause and no cure. They simply lay in the barracks, sweating and moaning, while Bridgewater's profits dwindled with each passing day. His wife, Eleanor, surprisingly, seemed to improve. After years of being bedridden with a wasting illness that no physician could properly diagnose, she began to walk the grounds, to take meals with vigor, to laugh for the first time in years. She spent hours in the kitchen with Amara, and Bridgewater would often hear them talking in low voices, though he could never quite make out what they were saying. "That woman has some kind of healing touch," Eleanor told him one evening at dinner. Her cheeks flushed with more color than he'd seen in a decade. "She knows remedies, Thomas. Old knowledge. She's been helping me." Bridgewater grunted non-committally, but inside, unease coiled like a snake. His wife was getting better, while everything else around him crumbled. It wasn't natural. By the end of the month, his overseer, a brutal man named Cyrus Polk, who'd made his reputation beating convicts into submission, disappeared. His horse returned to the stables riderless, Polk's coat still draped across the saddle. But the man himself was never found. Search parties combed the woods for 3 days and discovered nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. "The curse," the workers whispered among themselves. "She's done for Polk, just like she done for the others." Bridgewater found Amara in the garden one evening, tending to the vegetables with steady, patient hands. The setting sun cast her in silhouette, and for a moment she looked like something out of an ancient painting. A priestess, a queen, a force of nature contained in human form. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Amara didn't look up from her work. "I am a woman, Mr. Bridgewater, just like any other woman you might see walking down the street in Charleston. Though I suspect you don't see us as people at all, do you?" "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "The accidents, the misfortunes, it's too much to be coincidence. What did you do to Cyrus Polk?" "I did nothing to Mr. Polk," Amara said calmly, finally, raising her eyes to meet his. "Though I can't say I mourned his disappearance. He was a wicked man who found a wicked end. As for your other misfortunes," she smiled slightly, "perhaps you should consider that you have built your prosperity on the suffering of others. The universe has a way of balancing such scales." "That's superstitious nonsense," Bridgewater said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Amara stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Let me tell you a story, Mr. Bridgewater. When I was a girl in Georgia, my grandmother told me about our people. We came from a long line of healers and wisdom keepers in West Africa. The slavers took our bodies, chained us, brought us across the water in the bellies of ships. But they couldn't take what we carried inside. Our knowledge, our power, our connection to forces older than their Christian God." She took a step closer, and Bridgewater found himself unable to move, rooted to the spot like one of the ancient oaks that dotted his property. "My grandmother taught me that justice is a patient force," Amara continued. "It doesn't always come quickly, but it comes. Every man who has owned me has learned this lesson. Not through anything I do directly. Oh no, I never raise a hand, never poison food, never set fires. I simply exist, and the wickedness that men do comes back to visit them, amplified by forces they cannot see or understand. "You're threatening me," Bridgewater said, trying to muster his authority. "I'm explaining the world to you," Amara corrected gently. "There's a difference. You bought me for $10, Mr. Bridgewater, the cheapest purchase of your life, but I wonder, what will it cost you in the end?" That night, Bridgewater couldn't sleep. He paced his study, drinking whiskey and trying to convince himself that he was still in control, still the master of his domain. But the house, which had always felt like a monument to his success, now seemed to press in on him with malevolent intent. The following week brought disasters in rapid succession. A creditor Bridgewater had thought bought off appeared with legal papers proving that the deed to Magnolia Grove had been secured against a loan Bridgewater had taken out 3 years prior. The interest had been compounding, and now the debt had grown to nearly the full value of the property. Bridgewater had 3 months to pay or lose everything. His cotton fields, which should have been flourishing, withered inexplicably. An expert from the agricultural college examined the soil and found nothing wrong. The blight made no scientific sense. It simply was. The state inspector arrived unannounced to examine the conditions of the convict laborers. He found violations that Bridgewater had committed openly for years without consequence. Overcrowding, inadequate food, excessive work hours, documented brutality. Suddenly, mysteriously, the authorities cared. His leasing contract was suspended pending investigation. Without the convict labor, Bridgewater had no workforce. Without a workforce, he had no income. Without income, he couldn't pay his debts. He began to fall apart. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued to blossom. She had taken to wearing bright colors, to singing in the mornings, to walking the property with Amara, as if they were equals, as if they were friends. Bridgewater watched from his study window, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand, and felt the world he'd built crumbling around him like sand. "She's bewitched you," he accused Eleanor one evening. "That woman has done something to you." Eleanor looked at her husband with something like pity. "She's helped me, Thomas, really helped me. She's shown me that there are different ways to be strong, different ways to live, and she's made me see what you've become, what you've always been, what I've become." Bridgewater laughed bitterly. "I'm a successful businessman. I've built something from nothing." "You've built a kingdom on suffering," Eleanor said quietly, "and now it's collapsing. Maybe it's time to let it fall." That night, Bridgewater made a decision. He would sell Amara, get her off his property, break whatever curse or connection was destroying his life. He'd take a loss. Hell, he'd give her away if necessary. He just needed her gone. But when he went to the cabin where she stayed, he found it empty. The door stood open, swinging gently in the night breeze. Amara's few possessions, a change of clothes, a small cloth bag, were gone. She had simply walked away. The search for Amara turned up nothing. It was as if she'd dissolved into the night, leaving no trace behind. Bridgewater reported her as a runaway, but the authorities were too busy investigating his own crimes to care much about one missing woman. Within 2 months, Bridgewater lost Magnolia Grove. The creditor foreclosed, and the property was sold at auction. Eleanor left him, moving to Charleston to live with her sister, and filed for divorce on grounds of cruelty and neglect. The investigation into his convict leasing practices resulted in criminal charges: fraud, assault, manslaughter for 3 deaths that occurred under his watch. Thomas Bridgewater, who had built an empire on the backs of black bodies, found himself in prison. The irony was not lost on him as he sat in a cell, subjected to the same brutal conditions he'd once inflicted on others. At night, through the barred window, he sometimes heard singing, that same haunting melody Amara had sung on her first night at Magnolia Grove. But when he looked out, there was never anyone there. He lasted 6 months before the prison doctor found him dead in his cell. The official cause was heart failure, but those who saw the body whispered that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. Amara's story didn't end with her disappearance from Magnolia Grove. Over the following years, reports surfaced of a beautiful black woman appearing at auctions and labor camps across the South. Sometimes she'd be sold, sometimes she'd simply arrive as if summoned. And wherever she went, oppressors fell. A prison warden in Alabama, who was notorious for beating inmates to death, was found drowned in a locked water tower. A judge in Mississippi, who specialized in trumping up charges against black citizens to feed the convict leasing system, suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak, but fully aware, trapped in his own body. A plantation owner in Louisiana, who maintained slavery in all but name through debt peonage, watched his entire operation burn to the ground on a night with no lightning and no wind. Some said she was a ghost, a spirit of vengeance for all those who'd suffered under slavery and its lingering descendants. Others claimed she was a real woman, protected by powerful magic passed down through generations of African wisdom keepers. A few insisted she was multiple women, a network of freedom fighters using the same name and the same methods to strike fear into the hearts of those who would oppress. The truth, as with many truths, was likely more complex than any single explanation could capture. What is known is that by the turn of the 20th century, the practice of convict leasing had begun to decline in the South. Public outcry, changing economic conditions, and a series of scandals involving suspicious deaths and financial ruin among its practitioners all contributed. But those who worked in the shadows, who heard the whispers passed among black communities, knew another reason. They knew about the woman no one would bid on, the curse that walked on 2 legs, the justice that came singing in the night. In 1910, a letter arrived at the offices of the NAACP, newly formed and fighting against the tide of racial violence sweeping the nation. It was unsigned, written in elegant script on paper that seemed aged, before its time. The letter read, "To those who fight for freedom, know that you are not alone. Know that justice takes many forms, works through many hands. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends not just through the work of great men and women, but through forces older than this nation, deeper than its laws. I was once sold for $10. I've been sold many times, in many ways, but I have never been owned. No chains can hold what lives in the spirit. No auction block can diminish what we carry in our blood and bones. Tell our people to endure. Tell them that every cruelty has its accounting, every oppressor his reckoning. It may not come today or tomorrow, but it comes. As surely as the sun rises and the seasons turn, justice comes. The work continues the song goes on, and those who would make merchandise of human souls should know. They gamble with their lives every time they reach for the gavel. In solidarity and struggle, a friend, the letter was filed away, dismissed by some as the ravings of a traumatized survivor, honored by others as a message of hope from someone who'd suffered and survived. It remains in the NHACP archives to this day, a testament to a story that exists somewhere between history and legend, between fact and faith. And on quiet nights in certain parts of the South, old folks still tell stories about Amara, the woman who couldn't be owned, the curse that walked like a woman, the justice that came too slowly for the law, but right on time for the universe's accounting. They say she's still out there, wherever injustice reigns, wherever the powerful prey upon the powerless. They say you can hear her singing sometimes, if you know how to listen. And they say that those who traffic in human misery, who build their fortunes on suffering, should be very afraid, because the auction block is empty now, but the ledger is still open, and some debts, once incurred, can never be escaped.